Now that you've had an opportunity to write a little bit about your own perception and understanding of what critical thinking and analytical thinking may be, we're going to take a look at some baseline definitions and some aspects of critical thinking and look at the ideas that really drive critical thinking from a perspective of being an active, ongoing process or a generalized collection of ways in which you think. The video that you've seen after the in-class writing 4 assignment was a video that explains at a very base level the idea of critical thinking and the need for critical thinking to be embedded into our society. The big takeaway from that particular video is to realize that critical thinking is something that most people do not engage in effectively. While we bolster critical thinking and we like to say that it's part of the bedrock of democracy in our education, in this particular democracy, it's not something that we do effectively because we're not 100% mindful of what it really means. And so some common misconceptions, for instance, of critical thinking is the idea that it's synonymous with criticizing, either accepting, yes, I believe this information or I don't, or I accept this information or I don't, or this information is going to influence me and my behaviors or it will not. When critical thinking is so much more than that. Critical thinking is a generalized way of thinking. It's not unlike academic writing, actually, in that it's a process that's dynamic and takes time. You have to learn how to become a better critical thinker. And in many ways, you can always improve on those abilities in some way throughout your life. What's important about critical thinking is that it's a way to think clearly in an organized way. And it's also going to be reflected in your writing. Writing and thought are inextricably bound, meaning that if you're not thinking clearly, if you're not sorting through evidence and logic and reasoning correctly, it's going to be reflected in your writing. And those are some of the ideas we're going to look through in a few slides here. One definition of critical thinking is the art of making clear, reasoned judgments based on interpreting, understanding, applying, and synthesizing evidence gathered from observation, reading, and experimentation. This is a definition from the University of Edinburgh, 2020. This particular definition will show you that critical thinking is not only a process, but hence this definition, it is an art form. It's something that has to be honed in on, practiced, and perfected. Making clear, reasoned judgments. So that is making objective academic assertions and claims based on information that is presented in the sources that you're studying and the information that you're reading or intaking. Also, you'll notice several processes in the definition, such as synthesizing evidence, gathering, sorting through evidence, filtering through evidence gathered from reading, experimentation, and observation. Everything you do in college is going to be a collection or some type of engaging in those activities. And more times than none, the way that you assess or the way that your professors and instructors assess how well you do will be your written recollection or understanding of the ideas and concepts you're studying. And so it's important to be able to understand critical thinking and to tap into that way of thinking so that you're able to organize your writing, clearly, and so that it makes sense, that it's credible, that it bolsters your ethos, what we call your ethos, and that it can be trusted. This next slide here has another definition. It's a rather simplistic definition. Thinking critically, making sense of the world by carefully examining the thinking process to clarify and improve our understanding. I included this particular visual because it shows various aspects or facets of this generalized way of thinking, different parts of the process. What's important to note is that this is not a prescriptive or chronological list of steps. The challenge of critical thinking, and which makes it so daunting, is that one has to juggle all of these ideas at the same time. And so one of those, the first block you see on the far left, is thinking actively. This is being mindful, knowing that information is going to change. It's being purposeful in your way of thinking. What are you trying to understand? What are you trying to assess? What's the outcome from that? The next block is carefully explaining situations. And so what you find at this level of thinking in university and in college is that issues and concepts are often very complex. They're not simplistic. They can't be easily explained. They can't be easily synthesized. The information and evidence can't be easily sorted and regurgitated. It can only be explained in relation to different parts. So for instance, you have a complex idea, you have to break that idea down into different sub ideas, and then you have to sort what ideas are similar, what ideas are different, and how they're related. And moreover, how do those differences and similarities, causes, effects, etc., cause other implications? And so you're carefully looking at different aspects of a whole situation in order to explain or in order to make sense of it and have that reflected in your writing. Another aspect here is thinking independently. This is very important. This concept has to do with not being gullible, being able to suspend bias or being able to detect bias in certain works and in certain content that you are trying to study or intake, and to be able to think independently and objectively from that, to not be swayed by a bias, whether it's yours or someone else's. Another aspect, viewing situations from different perspectives. This idea has to do with multiple oppositional viewpoints that exist. You may have a certain set of beliefs, you may have a certain set of opinions and a certain worldview. Critical thinking has to do with understanding all of the other oppositional viewpoints that exist in the world that may contradict everything that you believe and may test some of the ideas, theories, and concepts that you believe and attest to be true. And so, again, that's part of breaking a subject or a concept down into multiple elements. Part of those elements that you break those down into will be the different viewpoints that may exist around a subject or a topic. Finally, and most importantly in terms of writing, discussing those ideas in an organized way is paramount. And so you must be able to sort all of your thoughts. You must be able to sort through all of the challenging aspects of critical thinking. But if you're studying something in particular, the idea would be to really look at the second block in this critical thinking model, which is explaining situations, concepts, ideas, being able to look at the overall situation, but then break it down into different contextual elements and be able to explain the heart of your idea by connecting those elements, what's similar, what's different, and why that matters and how it has an impact. Another important element of critical thinking that's not on this particular slide relates to ideas having some type of impact or some type of implication on real world practice. You know, one of the things that we try to do when we, for instance, write research papers is to always bring it back, always connect it to implications for real world practice. What does this mean for real world practitioners of your field? And how can it improve a process, or how can it improve a phenomenon in the world? And if it doesn't do that in some kind of way, it's lacking a critical component. Sorry about that. I'm having to pause as I go here, so just ignore when I have to do that. So if you can extract the major ideas of critical thinking, you don't have to know all of that, because you will learn this as you start engaging in this way of thinking. And especially in this class, as you write the papers that you're going to write, you're going to be tasked with doing these things. So I'm not worried about you understanding that yet, because you will as we get through this process. But there are two overarching components of critical and analytical thinking. The first is the idea of analysis, analytical. This is relating to or using analysis or logical reasoning. So what does that mean? What does analysis mean? A good definition of analysis is a detailed examination of the elements or structure of something. That something in this case would be whatever it is you're studying, whatever information you're reading, what articles you're reading, what research you're conducting, what sources you're sorting through. It's that idea of breaking down items into its baseline elements while still understanding the overall concept or the overall idea, but really being able to look at minute individual baseline elements or levels that impact whatever it is you're studying and to make connections between those items. The other concept is the idea of being critical, and that is based in the notion of objective analysis and evaluation of an issue in order to form a judgment. And what that is essentially saying is suspending your worldview, suspending any bias or connection you have with a topic, and taking yourself outside of it, becoming an objective academic party, and being able to engage in analysis and break a situation down into its baseline elements and to determine what evidence is involved, what reasoning and logic is involved, so that you know whether or not you can trust information or whether or not you want to use it. And the more you think in this way, the more it's going to be reflected in your writing. And so it's not just about you analyzing the content or being critical or analytical about the content you're reading and studying. It's also going to trickle down to how you present your understanding of those topics. If there are words to remember that are crucial, it would be these words at the bottom of the slide. Critical and analytical thinking are both rooted in analysis, objectivity, reasoning, logic, and judgment. We'll talk about half of those later in the class when we start studying argumentation, rhetoric, and persuasion. That's when we start looking at the actual framework behind argument, what makes an argument credible. We will look at modes of persuasion such as ethos, pathos, logos, and being able to analyze an argument or any type of work based on whether or not the assertions and claims are backed by logical evidence and reasoning. One of the most challenging things to do when you start engaging in academic writing, and I've mentioned this before, but I'm going to mention it again, is to separate yourself. We are so often conditioned to want to or be able to provide what we believe about something, to shed some light on our worldview, our subjective life experience, why we believe what we believe. All of that's important because it makes you who you are, and it allows you to understand your world and the place and your place in it. Helps you understand society and interpret everything around you. However, the challenge is to separate yourself from that and to understand concepts from an academic, objective point of view. I put a quote here because this is really important. The most important ability that a thinker or a critical thinker in this instance can have is the ability to monitor and assess his or her own thinking while processing the thinking of others. And so in order to set your worldview aside and to set all of your personal beliefs and opinions aside to engage in academic thinking, you have to know that you are doing that. You have to be aware of when you are doing that. And so much of that is subconscious. It happens out of habit. It's habitual action. And so the reason I put that quote here is I want everyone to start thinking, when you start writing, start thinking about the line of objectivity and how close you are to crossing it, if at all. The idea is to constantly set aside yourself, set aside your opinions, set aside your beliefs, suspend your worldview, and instead look just at the situation at hand, what you're studying, what you're reading, and focusing on just that particular subject, content, evidence, reasoning, logic, and then being able to break it down into multiple elements and explain it by those elements. But how do we do this in our own majors, whether it be accounting, education, no matter if you're studying psychology, if you're in a pre-professional program going into veterinary medicine, despite any field that you are interested in pursuing, what is common among all fields is the ability of critical and analytical thinking. And so understanding what it is important. Sorry if you hear my cat meowing in the background. Understanding what the idea of critical thinking and analytical thinking both are is extremely important. But the most important practical concept for you as an academic is to be able to actually practice it. So you have to know what it is, but you also have to know the how do I do it? You have to know how to operationalize those ideas. And so what we do is we take these concepts and we extract them and we apply them to our own thinking in relation to your major. And so you do this with any class you're in, but to really make this useful for you, start thinking in terms of what you're studying, what you want to do, the reason or the impetus why you're in college. You're going to start developing a critical and analytical framework that is associated with your specific discipline and will lend much better to you improving as you go on a path to where you want to be. And like I mentioned before, these steps are not linear. You have to engage in all of these different things at the same time. The ideas and concepts in higher education are too complex to be approached by linear steps. And so, like the diagram I showed just a moment ago of the various aspects of critical thinking, and those are just some of the prevalent ideas behind critical thinking and how you engage in critical thinking. But the idea is that you're juggling these at the same time. You're learning how to be dynamic minded and keeping multiple things, multiple elements of awareness going at one time or simultaneously. The big idea is to know the main concepts and then be able to really start looking at two different levels of analysis to be able to engage in critical thinking for academic writing. What is important to know is that when we are writing, we have complete control over our unity, flow, organization, logic, and reasoning. We have complete autonomy on how clear, concise, specific, detailed, analytical, and critical our writing is. That is one perk of writing, is that you have the ability to perfect what it is you're communicating. However, the burden falls on us as academic writers to make sure that our thinking is in line and at the caliber it should be so that it is reflected in your writing. It's a common pitfall and mistake of academic writers is that they'll sit down and write stream of consciousness without actively engaging in critical thinking, and that is impacting the writing.